So I have the pleasure today to present preliminary results, so the first results of this year's PoS benchmarking study. So it's the second time we benchmarked the most relevant proof-of-stake chains against each other in terms of energy consumption and carbon emissions. So jumping in, plan for today is 3 topics. So I will give you a quick intro about CCRI, Crypto Carbon Ratings Institute, for those who don't know us. Second, I would share the results of this year's benchmarking study, which includes Avalanche, as well as 6 other projects. And last, I would put the results into the larger context, implications, and what this means for the entire crypto industry. So jumping in, who we are. So I co-founded together with Lena and Uli CCRI. The 3 of us were all at one point in time at MIT and TU Munich and conducted research on climate economics, in my case, or Uli is more on the technical side of the blockchain world, and Lena is wrapping up her PhD on climate finance. And so we started looking into the topic over 7 years ago. So carbon emissions of Bitcoin was part of my PhD back then. And our first publication landed quite well in the news. So my statement on CNN received over 1 billion people in 2019. And in the years afterwards, there was no real commercial interest. So this was a purely academic-driven effort. And at one point in time in 2021, after the Tesla investment into Bitcoin and more institutional investors moving into the space, we received more and more requests about up-to-date data on our papers. And that's how we set up CCRI as a data provider, as kind of a unique data set of CO2 emission data and energy consumption data for digital assets. So that's how it started. And in 2021, as I said, we set up the company. And since then, our team has grown with former students. And we're based in Munich and Zurich at the moment. So what do we do? So our business model has basically 4 steps. So we measure networks. So we set up nodes ourselves in the networks and conduct electricity consumption measurements in our lab. Second, we use this data to model the entire networks. So based on electricity consumption drivers like transaction volume, node counts, and other factors. Third, we are capable to allocate those emissions to activities, and activities can be single users, activities can be layer 2 networks, can be tokens, can be NFTs and other activities. So we are capable of assigning a specific carbon footprint to any type of activity. And last, reporting. So in some instances, we support companies and investors directly with their carbon accounting based on their assets under management, based on their transaction activities. On the right side, a snapshot of a few of our clients, and you can see that the kind of core of our clients is working directly with the networks, like Avalanche, Polygon, Tron, or Consensus, which mandated us to measure before and after the merge. But our data is also used by intermediaries, so like carbon accountants that use our emission factors, or also tech companies like Microsoft or Salesforce that use also our emission factors for carbon accounting purposes and to point their customers to low energy consumption blockchain solutions. We also have a few exotic clients like UNICEF, where we donate our data so that they can offset their crypto donations. So they apparently receive quite a few cryptocurrency donations, and based on our data, they calculate the emissions associated with those donations and use this as the basis to offset the emissions. Now I talked a lot about who we are and what we do, so shifting gears a bit into this year's benchmarking study to give you a sense of what we did. So the approach of the study basically had 4 steps. First, we selected which chains we would include in the study. In this year's study, we have 7 chains included. The selection was based on the chains that we had already in last year's study, plus we added projects that were relevant in terms of market capitalization. So that's how, for instance, Cosmos moved into the sample, which was not part of last year's study. Second, we conducted the actual electricity measurements. So we have a hardware landscape which is representative for the nodes that run in those networks. So we have 6 different types of hardware setups on which we set up nodes for all those networks and conducted actual measurements in our lab for the electricity consumption over a certain period of time. At the same time, recording activity in the network, like transactions and node counts and other factors that drive electricity on the network level. Third step, we determined the carbon footprint. And to do so if you know electricity consumption and you know the location of the nodes, you can look into the emission intensity of the electricity that is used of the node providers. And based on the grid level emission factors, we were capable to calculate the carbon footprint of the 7 networks in scope of this year's study. And last step, that's what we are currently wrapping up. We are now looking into performance metrics like energy consumption per node and things like that. And the target is to publish the study within the next couple of weeks. To share a few first results, looking at the total annualized network electricity consumption, so meaning at the point of measurement, extrapolating to the entire year. And as you can see, out of the 7 projects, Avalanche has the lowest electricity consumption of the non-platform chains, and overall out of our sample, actually the lowest and the second lowest, looking at the entire sample, with only Polkadot having lower electricity consumption. Looking at the absolute level, so 474 megawatt hours as an annualized electricity consumption for Avalanche. To give you a sense, that's about 45 US households in terms of electricity consumption, which is neglectable compared to proof-of-work currencies, and I'll talk about this in a minute. At the same time, you can also see that there are quite big differences between the projects. So, for instance, a Solana or Ethereum, which has 10x the electricity consumption of an Avalanche network. Looking at carbon emissions, the picture looks quite similar, so same sequence in terms of the ranking between the projects, as electricity consumption is highly correlated with carbon emissions, as the carbon intensity of the networks does not differ significantly. And you can see that Avalanche specifically had a carbon footprint, the network of 580 tons, annualized figure again, which you could also compare. A US citizen has an average carbon footprint of 16 tons, so to give you a sense of if that's a lot or a small number. In the report, you will then also find further details about our assessment. So, for instance, the drivers behind those metrics, I'm not sure if you can read, this is a bit small, but you can then find, pointing you to a few highlights, for instance, that these networks highly differ in terms of their setup. So some are much more decentralized, have much higher node count. So for instance, a Ethereum versus a Polkadot, so to highlight the highest and the lowest node count here, with 600 versus over 10,000 nodes, which is kind of, if we talk about PoS, to see that there are different types and that these networks are highly different, I think is quite an insight to highlight. Second, you can see that transaction count is a driver of electricity consumption. So looking at the lowest lane of Solana with the highest transaction count, or Cardano with the lowest transaction count, this directly translates into electricity consumption on a node level. And third, the node count is kind of a key driver behind the total network electricity consumption. So the higher your node count, the higher the entire electricity consumption of the networks. And last, one thing to highlight is that compared to our study last year, electricity consumption has changed quite a bit. So the most severe change obviously was Ethereum, due to the switch from proof of work to proof of stake. But you can also see that, for instance, in Solana or Cardano, electricity consumption jumped quite a bit due to different hardware requirements, for instance. At the same time, you can also see that the per node electricity consumption of Avalanche, for instance, declined, so went down, which can be attributed to software improvements and other factors. So one last thought on the numbers. So if you put the figures into the bigger picture, if you now look at emissions from cryptocurrencies overall, the Bitcoin network now accounts for over 95% of emissions. And this has changed last year significantly. So after Ethereum, which was the second proof-of-work currency with significant market cap left, switched to proof-of-stake, and this was also kind of a project of us to measure this. Electricity consumption of the Ethereum network dropped by over 99.9%. And therefore, you can see that proof-of-stake currencies directionally have 10,000x less energy consumption than proof-of-work networks. And if you look at the market cap list, you can see that Bitcoin is the only remaining proof-of-work currency with significant market cap, followed by Dogecoin and Litecoin, which are already at a level of 1% of the total crypto market cap. And that's why kind of the carbon footprint of Bitcoin is becoming more and more the largest piece to look at when you talk about crypto emissions. So what does this mean now? Implications of the study results. So why is it important to continue monitoring and disclosing energy efficiency and carbon emissions of proof-of-stake networks if we just learned that Bitcoin is basically accountable for over 95% of all emissions? 4 reasons. First, transparency. So it's vital to educate users, policymakers, regulators about these differences. So that they are aware and that effective regulation can be tailored. Second, energy efficiency is also a differentiator. So as we saw, looking at the different proof-of-stake protocols, there are still differences of 10x and more. So therefore, it's still a decision criteria for developers, NFT creators, and specifically corporates. So in the past months, we've worked a lot with traditional companies like L'Oreal, which are moving into the Web3 space, and sustainability and energy consumption is kind of a key differentiator there. Third, those numbers are also the basis for climate strategies and mitigation strategies. So Avalanche, for instance, uses our number as the basis to offset the emissions with Nori, and therefore having a robust database from a third party is kind of the foundation to realize such strategies. And last, regulation. So some of you might have followed the recent MiCA vote in Europe, which entails disclosure of climate impacts. So the ESMA is now working on detailed rules, how this will look like, and we are in contact with ESMA, for instance, to support them in this task. So looking forward, so my personal opinion is that there will be more and more disclosure requirements for projects, for crypto asset service providers, exchanges, whoever is involved in the ecosystem, and therefore such numbers as in the study kind of provide a solid foundation for that. Here we'll close. Thanks a lot for your attention, and if you have any questions, please reach out or talk afterwards. Thank you.